Please, he hasn't eaten a real meal in 8 months. I've seen how the staff eat what you cook." It was 11:30 at night in Cheongdam, behind a restaurant called Yan, where the loading dock still smelled of burnt thyme and clarified butter under the service lights. The woman pressed against the steel door was not staff, and she said the words like someone who had rehearsed them twice and abandoned the rehearsal both times. She was the aunt of the owner's only son, and the owner was Kang Do-yoon, a chef spoken of in low, careful tones even by men who had trained under 3-star kitchens in Paris and Copenhagen. Inside, scrubbing the last pot of a 14-hour shift, stood Amarachi Okafor, a Nigerian line cook whose visa existed only because this job did. The sensible answer, the answer that kept a work permit intact, was no. What she did instead started with one small pot on a back burner nobody was supposed to touch, and it ended, 11 months later, with half of Seoul's dining press watching to see what she would do next. Two years earlier, a kitchen manager scouting a culinary showcase in Lagos had watched Amarachi finish a dish of braised oxtail and pepper soup reduction in under 6 minutes, under competition lights, without once checking a recipe card, and had offered her a sponsored contract in Seoul before the judges finished scoring. The visa attached to that contract, a specialized worker classification, was not paperwork to her. It was the only bridge between a mother's rent in Lagos and a country where Amarachi had built, plate by plate, a life she intended to keep. Chef Kang Do-yoon ran his kitchen at Yun the way surgeons ran an operating theater. Flat voices, no wasted motion, no second chances on a botched sauce. Every new hire heard the same rule inside their first week, delivered without embellishment. Nobody feeds his son. Nobody at Yun had ever needed to ask him why twice. The boy at the center of the aunt's plea was 8 years old, and inside the restaurant's private staff roster, his name was written only as an initial, a small mercy nobody had ever explained. Since his mother, Seo-yoon, had died of illness the previous winter, Ha-yoon had eaten almost nothing but plain white rice, 3 bites some nights, none on others, while 2 pediatric specialists and a nutritionist with color-coded reward charts had each, in turn, run out of ideas. His father could coax 18 courses out of Icelandic langoustine and 40-year Hanwoo beef without raising his voice, and could not get his own son to lift a spoon of soup to his mouth. He had mostly stopped trying to talk about it out loud, the way certain kinds of grief get folded small and put in a drawer nobody opens on purpose. What began at that service door was not a rescue, not exactly, and it was not yet the love story either of them would eventually admit to. It was a woman staking the only leverage she had, her job, her sponsorship, her legal right to remain in a country she had chosen, on a child nobody else had been able to reach, in direct violation of a rule the boy's own father had written. It was a widower who noticed everything that happened in his kitchen except, for a long stretch of months, the quiet kindness taking place in it after closing, and it was an 8-year-old who would decide, one spoon at a time, whether the world still owed him anything close to trust. This is the full account of how a bowl of plain rice became, eventually, a table set for 3. Amarachi heard the knock before she understood it was meant for her. It was 2 soft raps on the steel service door, low enough on the panel that at first she mistook it for a delivery crate settling against the frame. She was alone in the back kitchen, elbow deep in the last stock pot of the night, the rest of the line already gone home on the last trains. When she opened the door, Yoon-hee was standing under the flickering bulb with her coat buttoned wrong, one button off from top to bottom, the kind of mistake a composed woman only makes when she has stopped noticing her own hands. Amarachi recognized her from the one time she had come to collect Ha-jun early, a hurried, apologetic woman who worked in insurance and had inherited, without ever asking for it, the job of raising her sister's son 3 afternoons a week. He hasn't eaten a real meal in 8 months, Yoon-hee said again, quieter this time, as if saying it softer might make it less true. Amarachi thought of the rule posted unofficially in every mind on that line: no one feeds the chef's son. She thought of her visa, sponsored, renewable, revocable. Then she thought of the boy she had seen twice, sitting very still at a corner table with a bowl he never touched, and she opened the door wider. Three stations down from where Amarachi worked, Kang Do-yoon was still reviewing the following week's tasting menu, a habit that had survived his wife's death the way certain habits survive anything, mechanically, without asking permission. He had built Yan over 11 years into a restaurant critics described with words like exacting and merciless, words he had never disputed because he considered them accurate. He ran a pass of 12 cooks with the economy of a man who believed excellence and gentleness rarely shared a kitchen, though those who had watched him teach a nervous apprentice how to break down a turbot knew that was not entirely true. So-yoon had done the cooking at home, always, badly by professional standards and perfectly by every standard that mattered to their small family, and since she had gone, the apartment kitchen had not been used for anything beyond boiling water for Ha-jun's rice. Do-yoon did not know, that particular night, that his sister-in-law was standing at his own back door, asking a line cook to break the one rule he had never once had to enforce, because no one had ever tried to break it. He signed off on the menu, turned off the pass light, and went home to an apartment where his son was, once again, asleep with an empty bowl beside the bed. Yoon-hee could recite the timeline by heart because she had lived every entry in it. 6 weeks after the funeral, a pediatrician had diagnosed nothing physically wrong and referred them to a feeding specialist. 4 months in, the specialist's exposure exercises, new foods placed beside the rice, never forced, just present, had produced no change beyond a boy who now flinched at unfamiliar smells. A nutritionist's sticker chart lasted 5 days before Ha-jun stopped looking at it altogether. What no one wrote in a chart was the specific detail Yoon-hee had noticed herself, twice, when she picked him up from the staff meal at Yeon. Ha-jun did not refuse everyone's food, only food that arrived formally, on his father's plates, cooked in his father's kitchen, in the kitchen that used to belong, in some unspoken way, to his mother's kind of home. He had once eaten 4 spoonfuls of a cook's forgotten instant noodles, straight from a paper cup at the prep table, quickly, like a secret. Yoon-hee had watched that, said nothing to Do-yoon, and filed it away until the night she stood at Amarachi's service door with a theory she could not yet prove, that the boy did not need a specialist. He needed a kitchen, with no name attached to it. Amarachi's contract, 4 pages of formal Korean and English she had read more times than any cookbook, contained a clause she had memorized without meaning to. Sponsorship was contingent on continued employment in good standing, and good standing was defined, in practice, by Chef Kang's exclusive judgment. Breaking a house rule he had written himself was not a gray area. She let Yoon-hee into the narrow hallway between the walk-in and the dry storage, away from the cameras that covered the pass and the dining room but had never been extended to the staff corridor, a detail she had clocked on her first week the way she clocked the location of every fire extinguisher and every exit. "I can try one dish," Amarachi said. "One. If your nephew hates it, or if anyone sees, I stop, and you never came here." Yoon-hee nodded so fast it looked like her neck might give out. Amarachi did not tell her that she had already decided, somewhere between the second knock and the fourth, that stopping was not something she planned to do easily. She thought of her own mother's kitchen, of the specific silence that settles over a house where a child will not eat, and she began pulling ingredients from the shelf reserved for staff meal, the only shelf in the building that was, technically, hers to use. Yoon-hee had chosen Amarachi for a reason she had never said aloud, not even to herself in those exact words. She had watched her, twice, feed a stray cat that slept near the dumpsters on freezing nights, crouching in her chef's whites with a small dish of scraps, unhurried, as though the cat's dignity mattered as much as its hunger. It was such a small thing to build a decision on. But Yoon-hee had also asked, quietly, 3 separate line cooks whether they thought any staff member might help off the books, and 2 had laughed at the question before she finished asking it, citing the rule, citing their own contracts, citing simple fear of a chef whose silence carried more weight than most men's shouting. Only one cook, a young woman from Busan, had hesitated before answering and finally said, "Ask Amarachi. She's the only one who doesn't act like this kitchen owns her." Yoon-hee had not fully understood the comment until she saw Amarachi answer the door without checking, first, whether anyone was watching. Every other option had cost Yoon-hee something already: money on specialists, favors on nutritionists, dignity on a chart that hung, ignored, on her nephew's refrigerator. This one might cost Amarachi far more than any of the others had cost her. The rule had not come from arrogance, though most of the kitchen assumed it had. 6 weeks after Seo-yoon's funeral, a well-meaning junior cook had taken it upon herself to make Ha-jun a plate of sweet glazed tteokbokki during a slow Tuesday service, delighted when the boy ate half of it, and had posted a photo of the empty plate in the kitchen group chat with 3 exclamation points. By the following week, Ha-jun expected sugar from every adult who approached him with food, refused anything without it, and Do-yoon had spent 2 months undoing a habit he had never authorized in the first place. He had tried himself exactly 11 times by his own private count to cook for his son at home, a rice porridge their pediatrician had specifically recommended, a mild egg dish Seo-yoon used to make, a soup Do-yoon remembered eating himself as a child during a fever. Ha-jun had eaten none of them, had sometimes cried without sound, tears sliding down while his face stayed perfectly still, a stillness Do-yoon recognized because he saw it in the mirror most mornings. The rule was not about control. It was the only wall Do-yoon had left standing between his son and one more well-intentioned failure. Amarachi wired $1,100 home on the 15th of every month, a figure that covered her mother's hypertension medication, a portion of her younger brother's school fees, and, some months, very little left over for herself. She thought about that number while she stood at the staff burner past midnight, turning down the heat on a pot she had no authorization to be using for anything but tomorrow's family meal. If Chef Kang found out and terminated her, her sponsorship ended within 30 days, and 30 days was not enough time to find another kitchen willing to sponsor a line cook's visa, however good her knife work. She had trained for 4 years to reach this kitchen, a diploma from a culinary institute in Lagos, an unpaid apprenticeship in a hotel kitchen in Paris that nearly bankrupted her, a resume built one brutal season at a time. None of it would matter if she got sent home over a pot of soup. And yet Amarachi kept stirring, because somewhere in the last 2 years she had stopped being able to walk past a hungry child, even one whose hunger looked, from the outside, like simple stubbornness. She measured the ground melon seeds into her palm and decided the risk was hers to spend as she liked. Chef Lim Jae-ho had worked the pass at Yeon for 22 years, longer than Do-yoon had owned it, and considered himself the last line of defense against the small erosions that eventually sank good kitchens, a borrowed ingredient here, an unlogged hour there, a junior cook who thought her talent excused her from procedure. He liked Amarachi's knife work, said so rarely, and distrusted, on principle, anyone who lingered in the kitchen after her shift technically ended. He had noticed, that first week, a faint trace of unfamiliar spice in the staff corridor near closing, something earthy and layered that did not belong to any dish on Yeon's menu, and he filed it away the way he filed every anomaly, without acting on it yet. Lim had built his career on the belief that rules existed because someone, eventually, always tested them, and that the kindest thing a veteran could do for a young cook was catch the small violation before it became a career-ending one. He did not yet know what Amarachi was doing in that corridor after hours, but Lim had outlasted 3 head chefs and 1 restaurant closure by trusting his nose over his affection for anyone, and his nose told him something in his kitchen had changed. On the first night, Amarachi built the dish the way she would have built it for a child back home who had never once been afraid of egusi soup. Ground melon seeds toasted lightly in a dry pan until they released their oil and turned the color of pale sand, then loosened with stock instead of the usual heavy palm oil, so the final soup came out thinner, gentler, more golden than red. She left out the habanero entirely, left out the crayfish that could overwhelm an unaccustomed palate, and used spinach in place of the bitter leaf that would have been traditional, chopped so fine it nearly dissolved into the broth. She was not diluting the dish out of embarrassment. She was doing what any good cook does for an audience of 1, adjusting technique without abandoning the bones of a recipe her grandmother had taught her mother, who had taught her, standing on a low stool 3 decades before Amarachi ever set foot on a plane. She ladled a small amount into a bowl meant for staff meal, plain white, no garnish, and set it in front of Ha-jun on an overturned crate that served, for 1 night only, as a dinner table in a hallway that smelled of bleach and dry storage cardboard. Ha-jun looked at the bowl the way he looked at every bowl that had been placed in front of him since winter, with the flat, exhausted suspicion of a boy who had disappointed enough adults to know that disappointing them again cost him nothing new. But this bowl did not look like the others. It was not on his father's white china. It had no careful swirl of oil on top, no herb positioned at a precise angle, and the woman who had made it was not watching him the way the specialists watched him, with a clipboard face that made his stomach close before the spoon even moved. She had gone back to washing a pot, her back half turned, humming something low he did not recognize. He picked up the spoon mostly, he would later half remember, because nobody was looking. The broth was warm and strange and faintly nutty, not sweet like the tteokbokki that had made him sick with wanting more of it, not bland like the rice that had become the only safe thing in his world. He took 1 spoonful. Then, after a long pause in which the woman still did not turn around, he took a second. He did not finish the bowl, but he set the spoon down gently instead of pushing it away, and that, though no one in the hallway said so out loud, was the first real change in 8 months. The second week, Amarachi made jollof rice with almost none of the pepper that gave the dish its usual heat. Tomatoes and onions blended down slow until the color deepened to a rust orange. Stock added a ladle at a time the way her mother had taught her, never dumped in all at once. She let the pot come to a simmer on the staff burner and then did something she had not planned in advance. She pulled a second stool beside her own, set it at exactly Ha-jun's height using a stack of 2 crates, and asked, without looking directly at him, whether he wanted to stir it. She did not explain why, did not frame it as therapy or progress, or a specialist's exercise. She simply handed him a long wooden spoon and went back to her own prep, chopping scallions with her attention pointed elsewhere, because she understood something the well-meaning nutritionist charts had missed. A boy who has lost control over the single largest thing in his life, his mother, does not need more adults deciding things for him. He needs 1 small pot where the decision is entirely his. How long to stir, how close to stand, whether to taste it from the spoon first or not at all. Ha-jun stirred for 6 full minutes without speaking, and Amarachi let the silence be enough. Do-yoon had come back to the restaurant that night for a forgotten set of knives, planning to be in and out within 5 minutes, when he heard, faintly, a sound from the staff corridor that did not belong to a closed kitchen at that hour. A child's low, uncertain laugh. He should have walked directly toward it. Instead, he stopped at the edge of the pass, in the half-dark where the hood lights had been switched off, and looked through the gap between 2 hanging pots at a scene he did not immediately understand. His son on a stool built from stacked crates, a wooden spoon in his hand, and a line cook he recognized but had rarely spoken to beyond service instructions, standing beside him with her back deliberately turned, giving the boy room that Do-yoon himself had never quite managed to give. He knew, with total clarity, that this violated a rule he had written and never once had to defend, because no one had tested it before. He also knew, watching his son stir a pot with something that looked, from a distance, almost like ease, that he was not going to say a single word. Not that night. He put his knives under his arm and left through the front, the long way, so neither of them would hear the door. Yoon-hee met Amarachi outside the staff entrance 2 days later, on her lunch break from the insurance office, holding 2 coffees she had bought without asking whether Amarachi even drank coffee. "He mentioned your name at breakfast," she said, handing one over. "He's never mentioned anyone's name at breakfast. Not even the specialists, and she costs more than my rent." Amarachi allowed herself a small, careful smile, the kind she had trained herself to keep small because bigger ones invited questions from people who might ask what, exactly, she had to be happy about at Yon these days. Yoon-hee's relief did not stop her from delivering, in the same breath, a warning she had clearly rehearsed on the subway over. Chef Lim had asked her, in passing, whether she had been in the kitchen recently, a question with no obvious reason behind it, unless he had noticed something. Amarachi felt the small warm relief of the last 2 weeks tighten back into the calculation she had been avoiding. She thanked Yoon-hee for the coffee, went back inside 10 minutes early, and spent the rest of her shift double-checking that every trace of egusi and jollof had been scrubbed from the staff burner before Lim's evening walkthrough, aware for the first time that being careful and being caught were not, in this particular kitchen, mutually exclusive outcomes. It was one of the newer line cooks, a Seoul native barely out of culinary school, who first explained to Amarachi exactly whose kitchen she had been quietly defying. Chef Kang Do-yoon had trained at a 3-star restaurant in Copenhagen before returning to Seoul at 31 to open Yon with money his own father had considered a foolish risk, and within 4 years had turned it into one of the most written-about tables in the country, a restaurant that took reservations 11 weeks out and had, twice, been profiled in international food magazines for its unforgiving precision. He was not merely her employer. He was, in the small, closed universe of Seoul's fine dining scene, close to untouchable, the kind of chef whose displeasure could end a young cook's career before it started, simply by making one phone call to a colleague. Amarachi absorbed this information the way she absorbed most difficult facts, without visible reaction, filing it beside the visa clause she already knew by heart. It did not change what she was doing in the staff corridor after hours. It did, for the first time, make her wonder what exactly she believed she was owed if anyone ever found out. Recognition, silence, or simply the ordinary mercy of being allowed to keep the job she had built her whole life around. Do-yoon had met So-yoon 11 years earlier at a produce market in Mapo, both of them reaching for the same crate of early spring greens at 6 in the morning, and she had let him have it only after he agreed to cook her something with it that same week. She had never worked in a professional kitchen a day in her life, and had still, somehow, been a better instinctive cook than most of his junior staff, feeding him rushed, imperfect, deeply seasoned meals throughout the 11 years of Yeon's rise. Meals he ate standing at their kitchen counter at midnight, more often than sitting at a table. When she died, quickly, of an illness that had given them only 4 months of warning, Do-yoon had discovered that grief, left alone, made him useless, and grief converted into discipline made him formidable. He had rebuilt his entire kitchen culture in the months after her funeral, around a standard so exacting that it left him no idle hour in which to feel anything, a standard the staff experienced as coldness and Do-yoon experienced, privately, as the only floor keeping him upright. He had not told anyone, not Lim, not his own sister-in-law, that the reason his home kitchen had gone unused since winter was that he could not stand in it without hearing So-yoon's voice correcting his knife angle. Amarachi turned the question over while portioning duck breasts for the following day's service, working the knife with the automatic precision that let her mind wander without endangering the meat. She was not doing this for Chef Kang's gratitude, which she assumed, correctly, he was constitutionally unable to express in any form she would recognize. She was not doing it for the boy's sake alone either, though that reason came closest to the truth. If she was honest with the part of herself she rarely consulted during a 14-hour shift, she was doing it because somewhere in the last 2 years of proving herself twice as fast and twice as clean as anyone else on the line, she had begun to feel like a set of hands rather than a chef, and the hallway with the overturned crate was the only place in the building where she got to cook something that was entirely, recognizably hers. She thought, not for the first time, about the sous chef position that had opened and closed twice without anyone considering her for it, and about the small restaurant she still pictured sometimes, with her own name on the door. She was not risking her visa for a reward. She was risking it because the alternative, saying no, would have cost her something she could not put a price on either. Lim's inventory sheet on Friday showed a discrepancy he could not immediately explain. 800 grams of ground melon seeds unaccounted for, an ingredient Yeong's menu did not use at all and had no business being in the walk-in in the first place. Ordered, according to the delivery log, by someone using the staff meal budget code. He cross-referenced the order against the schedule and found Amarachi's name attached to 3 separate purchase requests over the past month, each one small enough to avoid triggering an automatic review, each one for ingredients that appeared nowhere in Yan's official recipes. Lim did not immediately report the discrepancy to Do-yoon, partly because he had not yet built a theory that made sense of it, and partly because some cautious instinct told him this was not simple theft. Nothing was missing from the restaurant's stock in a way that suggested resale or waste. He began, instead, staying 15 minutes later than usual on the nights Amarachi closed, positioning himself near the dry storage under the pretense of reorganizing shelves, watching without confronting, the way he had learned, over 22 years, to catch problems before they became public ones. He told himself he was protecting the kitchen's standards. He did not yet let himself consider that he might, eventually, have to decide what those standards were actually for. By the 5th week, the Tuesday and Thursday night ritual had settled into something with its own quiet architecture. Yoon-hee brought Ha-jun to the service door at 9, after his tutoring session ended, and left him for 40 minutes while she ran errands she had previously had no time for, trusting a woman she had known for barely a month with the only thing in her life she could not afford to get wrong. Amarachi kept a small shelf in dry storage stocked, quietly, with her own ingredients now, bought with her own money after the melon seed order had made her nervous about the staff meal budget code. Ha-jun had started arriving already talking, a change so gradual that Amarachi almost missed the moment it happened, mentioning a classmate's paper airplane, a teacher's strict handwriting rules, small, ordinary complaints that any 8-year-old might have, the kind of complaints a boy who had gone quiet with grief does not usually bother making. He asked her, that Thursday, why her soup was orange instead of red like the pepper dishes he'd seen on television. Amarachi told him about her grandmother's kitchen, about a spice she had left out entirely for his sake, and watched him listen with the specific stillness of a child deciding whether a story is safe to be curious about. The following week, Ha-jun asked for something for the first time in 8 months, a request so unremarkable in form and so enormous in substance that Amarachi nearly dropped the ladle she was holding. "Can it have a little bit of the red thing next time?" he said, not looking up from the pot he was stirring. "Just a little." He meant the pepper she had described and deliberately withheld, left out of every dish since the first night out of caution, rather than any instruction from anyone. Amarachi said yes immediately, and then, catching herself, added that they would try a very small amount first, together, so he could decide if he liked it, rather than being told he should. She diced a sliver of pepper smaller than a fingernail and let him watch it disappear into the pot, let him control the exact moment the spoon went back in his mouth. He made a face at the first taste, more surprise than dislike, and asked for the ladle himself to add exactly one more sliver, no more. It was, Amarachi understood watching him negotiate his own portion of heat with total seriousness, the most agency the boy had exercised over anything since his mother's funeral, and it had happened over a pot of rice in a hallway that smelled of bleach. Do-yoon began finding reasons to stay later than the kitchen required, telling himself each time that the paperwork simply needed doing, the following week's menu simply needed one more revision, when in fact he had started arranging, without ever discussing it with anyone, for small conveniences to appear near the staff corridor on the nights he knew Yoonhee brought Ha-jun by. A better burner, quietly swapped in from the line's spare equipment, replaced the unreliable staff, one that had been sparking at the igniter for months. A proper folding table, sturdy and the right height, appeared to replace the stacked crates, delivered by a supplier invoice. Do-yoon paid personally, rather than through the restaurant's accounts, so it would not surface on any ledger Lim might review. He never left a note. He never once appeared in the corridor while it was happening, choosing instead to watch, occasionally, from the same gap in the past where he had first seen his son laugh, a habit he did not examine too closely, because examining it would have required admitting he was grateful to a line cook for succeeding where he, personally, had failed 11 separate times. He told himself the burner and the table were about safety. He did not tell himself the rest of it yet. Ha-jun had never left South Korea and had, until recently, thought of Nigeria mostly as a word from a geography lesson he had not paid attention to. Somewhere far away on the map his teacher rolled down over the whiteboard. He asked Amarachi, one Thursday while the rice cooked down slow, whether it was hot there all the time, whether the ocean was different, whether children his age also had tutoring after school, or whether that was just a Seoul problem. Amarachi answered each question fully, without the simplified voice adults sometimes used with him since his mother died, telling him about the harmattan wind that turned the sky the color of weak tea, about her own mother's market stall louder than anything he had ever heard, about a smaller version of himself learning to season soup by taste because their kitchen never owned a working set of scales. She did not tell him this was where the food came from, not directly, but he understood it anyway, the way children understand things sideways, that this soup and this rice connected her to a mother of her own, far away, the way his own mother's cooking used to connect him to something he had lost. He asked, quietly, if he could see a picture of her mother sometime, and Amarachi said yes. Progress, Amarachi had learned from raising two younger siblings while her own mother worked double shifts, was never a straight line, and the 7th week proved it without mercy. Ha-jun arrived on a Tuesday already closed off, shoulders drawn up near his ears, and refused to sit on the stool she had kept, refused the rice, refused even to hold the spoon when she offered it without comment. Yoonhee, collecting him later, explained in a whisper that it was the date, the specific date, 8 months exactly since the funeral, a day none of the adults around him had thought to prepare for, because none of them had realized a child could keep that kind of calendar in his body without ever writing it down. Amarachi did not push. She did not narrate the setback as a crisis, did not call the specialist, did not do anything except sit on her own stool a comfortable distance away and eat her own small bowl in silence, letting Ha-jun watch her eat without any pressure to join her. He did not touch his food that night. But he stayed in the hallway the full 40 minutes instead of asking to leave early, and Amarachi understood, watching him sit rigid and unreachable beside an untouched bowl, that showing up broken was still showing up, and that she was not in the business of fixing him. She was only in the business of keeping the door open. The night Do-yoon finally tasted it happened by accident, or so he told himself afterward. He had come to the staff corridor to retrieve a knife roll and found the pot still warm on the swapped-in burner, Ha-jun and Amarachi having left 10 minutes earlier, Yoonhee's schedule having run early for once. He should have walked past it. Instead, he found a clean spoon, lifted the lid, and tasted the jollof rice his son had been eating 3 times a week for 2 months without a single complaint reaching Do-yoon's ears, a fact that had puzzled him more than he admitted. The first thing he noticed was the restraint of it, the pepper held back to almost nothing, clearly built for a child's palate rather than an adult's. The second thing he noticed, and this was the one that made him set the spoon down slowly and grip the edge of the counter was that it tasted, in some structural way that had nothing to do with the specific spices, like a home-cooked meal, the particular imperfect warmth of food made by someone who loved the person eating it rather than someone performing for judges. His own restaurant, decorated with international awards and 11 weeks of advance reservations, did not taste like that. It had not tasted like that, he realized, standing alone in a corridor that smelled faintly of ground melon seed, since SEOUL'S died. Do-yoon found Amarachi the following evening before service, in the narrow gap between the walk-in and the prep table where deliveries usually piled up, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, because both understood exactly what conversation was about to happen, and neither wanted to be the one to start it wrong. "I know about the corridor," he said finally, and Amarachi felt her stomach drop the specific, familiar way it dropped whenever a supervisor said her name in a tone that meant paperwork. She began, out of pure reflex, to explain the visa clause, the sponsorship, the fact that she had never once used restaurant funds after the first order, but Do-yoon raised one hand, not sharply, and she stopped. "I tasted it," he said instead. "Last night, the jollof." He did not immediately say whether that meant she was fired or forgiven, and Amarachi, watching his face for the flat unreadability she had seen him wear through 100 services, saw instead something closer to exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of a man revisiting a memory he had spent 8 months trying not to have. "My wife used to make something like that," he said, "not the same, but like that." It was the first personal sentence Amarachi had ever heard him say to anyone in the building, and she understood, without being told, that she was not going to be reported. What developed between them over the following weeks was not, at first, anything either of them would have called romance, and Do-yoon was careful, almost stubbornly careful, not to let it become anything he could not defend to himself later. He began arriving in the corridor occasionally while Amarachi cooked, not to supervise but to ask small technical questions he genuinely wanted answered. Why she toasted the melon seeds dry instead of in oil, how she balanced the stock without the crayfish, most egusi recipes called for, what her grandmother had done differently from her mother. Amarachi answered plainly, without performing gratitude or deference, correcting him once when he suggested an adjustment that would have thrown off the whole dish, a correction he accepted without defensiveness, which surprised her more than anything else about him so far. There was no lingering, no charged silences engineered for effect. There was a widower relearning, cautiously, what it felt like to be curious about something outside his own kitchen's four walls, and a line cook allowing herself, cautiously, to be seen as more than a set of competent hands. Neither of them named what was happening. Both of them noticed that the 40 minutes on Tuesday and Thursday nights had become, without either fully admitting it, the part of the week they looked forward to most, which was its own kind of confession, spoken in the grammar of stock ratios and spice quantities rather than words. On a Thursday in the 9th week, Do-yoon stayed the entire 40 minutes for the first time, sitting on an overturned crate of his own beside his son, rather than watching from the pass, and something shifted in the small hallway that none of the three of them could have explained precisely. Ha-jun, delighted and slightly suspicious in equal measure at his father's unexpected presence, insisted on being the one to add the pepper, narrating each addition like a scientist reporting results. One sliver, wait, taste, another sliver. Amarachi let him direct the whole process, stepping back to let father and son stand shoulder to shoulder over the pot, Do-yoon's hand hovering near his son's without quite touching, ready to catch a dropped spoon that never fell. When the rice was finally done, all three of them ate from small bowls balanced on the folding table. No white china, no plating, no menu, and Ha-jun, midway through his second helping, said with his mouth still half full that this was better than any restaurant, including his father's, a sentence that made Do-yoon laugh out loud. A full, unguarded sound Amarachi had never once heard from him in 2 years of service, and that Yoon-hee, arriving early to collect her nephew, stood frozen in the doorway to witness, understanding immediately that she was interrupting something she should not yet mention to anyone outside that hallway. Lim chose a Monday morning, before service, to bring what he had gathered to Do-yoon directly, rather than to the investors first, a decision he considered, privately, an act of loyalty rather than betrayal. He laid it out plainly: unlogged ingredient purchases traced to Amarachi, a burner and a table that had appeared in the staff corridor without appearing on any invoice Lim could find, and, most recently, his own eyes, twice now, watching Chef Kang himself linger in that same corridor after hours. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything I can't prove," Lim said, standing with the particular stiffness of a man who has rehearsed a difficult conversation in the mirror. "But you wrote the rule. If it comes out that you and a sponsored line cook have been running something unofficial with your son, in this kitchen, the investors will ask questions neither of us wants to answer, and a journalist would ask worse ones." Do-yoon listened without interrupting, a habit that unsettled staff more than shouting would have, and when Lim finished, asked only one question in return. Had Ha-jun eaten more or less in the past 2 months than in the 6 before it? Lim, who genuinely did not know the answer, had no response ready, and the silence between them said more than either man's carefully prepared words had. Do-yoon spent the rest of that Monday running service with his usual flat precision while privately turning Lim's warning over from every angle. Because Lim was not wrong about any individual fact, only wrong, Do-yoon believed, about what those facts added up to. He respected Lim too much to dismiss him outright. 22 years of loyalty had earned the man a real hearing, not a formality. But Do-yoon also understood something Lim's inventory sheets could not capture, which was the sound of his son laughing in a hallway for the first time since a funeral neither of them had fully recovered from. He did not reprimand Amarachi that day, did not change the schedule, did not remove the burner or the table, and he was aware, moving through service with the same closed expression he always wore, that this silence was itself a decision, one that put Lim in the position of either escalating past his own chef or standing down. Do-yoon chose, deliberately, not to make that choice easy for anyone, including himself, because he had not yet decided what he was protecting, a rule he had written in grief, or the one thing that had worked since. He went home that night and, for the first time in 8 months, stood in his own kitchen long enough to open the refrigerator and actually look inside it. The formal warning, when it came 2 days later, arrived not from Do-yoon but from the restaurant's operations director, a soft-spoken man representing the investment group behind Yun, who explained, in the careful language of someone reading from notes, that unauthorized use of restaurant resources and premises after hours constituted a documented violation of Amarachi's employment terms, one that could, if repeated, affect her sponsorship status going forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The word sponsorship did the work of a shout. Amarachi sat through the meeting with her hands flat on her knees, a posture she had practiced since childhood for moments, requiring her face to reveal exactly nothing, and said only that she understood the concern and would take it under advisement, a phrase she had learned from a workplace handbook, precisely because it committed her to nothing. Walking back to the line afterward, she allowed herself, for the length of one hallway, to consider simply stopping, telling Yoon-hee she could not risk it anymore, letting the folding table and the swapped burner sit unused, protecting the only thing standing between her and a plane ticket she could not afford. She thought of Ha-jun's face over his second helping of rice. She did not stop that Thursday. Thursday arrived with a specific dread Amarachi had not felt since her first week at Yan, the sense of walking toward a decision that had already, quietly, been made for her by everything she had built in the past 10 weeks. She caught herself, twice while prepping the pot, calculating how she would explain this exact moment to her mother if it ended badly, the sponsored visa lost, the flight home unbought, 10 years of training amounting to a single soft-hearted mistake in a hallway. She thought too about the version of herself who would have said no at the service door in the first place, who would have kept her head down and her contract intact, and found that she did not particularly like that version, however much safer she would have been. Ha-jun arrived at 9 as always, uninterested in adult politics he did not know existed, already asking whether they could try the pepper one notch hotter tonight. Amarachi handed him the ladle without hesitation, because whatever Director Choi's warning meant for her future, it did not change what was true in this hallway. A boy who had not eaten a real meal in 8 months was, tonight, negotiating the exact heat level of his rice with the seriousness of a food critic, and Amarachi was not willing to be the adult who took that away from him out of fear. Han Su-min had covered Seoul's fine dining scene for 9 years and had learned, over that time, that the most reliable tips rarely came from official channels. They came from disgruntled staff, jilted investors, or in this case, an anonymous account that messaged her outlet's tip line with a single grainy photograph taken through a gap in a kitchen doorway, showing a black woman in chef's whites standing beside Kang Do-yoon's unmistakable son over a pot that was clearly not on Yeon's tasting menu. The message accompanying it was 3 lines long and carefully vague, mentioning unauthorized kitchen activity and the sponsored foreign staff, phrasing that told Su-min the tipster had access to internal paperwork, not just casual gossip. She did not yet know Amarachi's name. She did not yet know about So-yeon, or the 8 months, or the specialists who had failed where a hallway pot had not. What she knew professionally was that a story about a celebrated widower chef's kitchen harboring an off-the-books arrangement involving his grieving son and a foreign line cook was the kind that generated engagement, whether the underlying story was tender or scandalous. And Su-min had built her career on being first, not necessarily on being complete. She began making calls that same afternoon, starting with a junior cook at Yan she had cultivated as a source 2 years earlier during an unrelated story. The article that appeared 4 days later carried a headline Amarachi read 3 times before she fully absorbed it, describing a sponsored foreign cook feeding a star chef's son in secret kitchen sessions with the restaurant silent on an oversight failure. The piece never used the word scandal outright, but it did not need to. It used words like unsupervised, off the books, and vulnerable child, arranging true facts into a shape that erased everything Amarachi actually understood about what had happened in that hallway. It mentioned her visa status explicitly, framing her sponsorship as a form of leverage rather than a professional achievement she had earned through 4 years of training, and it quoted an anonymous kitchen source describing the arrangement as evidence of lax standards under a grieving chef who had, in the source's words, lost control of his own house. Amarachi read the comments section once, against her own better judgment, and saw herself described by strangers as everything from an opportunist to a homewrecker to, in one particularly cutting phrase, the help playing house with someone else's family. None of it mentioned the 8 months of white rice, or the sticker chart on the refrigerator, or the 4 spoonfuls of instant noodles eaten in secret at a prep table. It mentioned only enough to make the story sellable, and Amarachi understood, reading it standing alone in her small studio apartment, that the truth was no longer entirely hers to control. The article generated exactly the kind of attention the operations director had warned about: 3 canceled reservations from corporate accounts within the first day, and a pointed email from the investment group requesting a meeting within the week. Do-yoon read the piece twice, once for its content and once, more carefully, for its omissions, noting precisely where the reporter had chosen ambiguity over the more difficult, less profitable truth that his son had gone from eating almost nothing to eating 3 meals a week because of the woman the article painted as a liability. He understood, with the particular clarity grief had taught him over the past 8 months, that he had a choice between 2 forms of protection: protecting the restaurant's polished public image by distancing himself from Amarachi entirely, which would satisfy the investors and likely end her employment within the month, or protecting the truth of what had actually happened in that corridor, which meant standing publicly beside a decision the entire dining press was currently framing as a scandal. He called Lim into his office that afternoon, not to reprimand him for the leak, which he suspected but could not prove came from somewhere near Lim's own orbit, but to ask him directly whether, having watched the whole arrangement unfold at close range, Lim genuinely believed it had harmed his son. Amarachi requested a meeting with Do-yoon the following morning, the first time in her 2 years at Yon that she had formally requested anything, and she arrived having decided, somewhere on the walk over, that she would not spend it apologizing for something she did not consider a mistake. "I am not the villain in that article," she said, before he could speak, "and I am not going to sit quietly while people who have never met your son decide I was exploiting him." She laid out, plainly and without raising her voice, exactly what the article had erased: her culinary training, her 4 years building toward this exact kitchen, the specific technical adjustments she had made to a family recipe so an 8-year-old could eat it safely, none of which resembled the reckless improvisation the piece implied. She said she understood the restaurant's exposure, and she understood, better than anyone in that building, what she personally stood to lose if her visa was reviewed. What she would not accept, she told him, was being reduced in public to the help, a phrase she repeated back to him exactly as the anonymous comment had used it, watching his expression change as he heard, for the first time from her rather than from a headline, how completely the article had stripped her of her own competence. She was owed, she said, an answer about what happened next, not eventually, now. Do-yoon did not answer Amarachi that morning with words, not fully, though he told her he heard her and meant it. He answered 3 days later by summoning his head of communications and proposing something the woman initially assumed she had misheard: a press dinner, held at Yon within the month, built entirely around the dish that had started the controversy, credited on the printed menu not to the restaurant's kitchen collectively, but to Amarachi Okafor by her full name and title. The operations director objected in the planning meeting, arguing that amplifying the story risked deepening it rather than closing it, and Do-yoon, in the flattest voice anyone in that room had heard him use, said that the story was already public, and the only choice remaining was whether Yun controlled the true version of it or continued absorbing the false one. He intended to cook the dish himself, alongside Amarachi, in front of the same press that had turned her sponsorship into a liability, because he understood, finally, that half measures, a quiet internal exoneration, a private raise, a discreet transfer of blame onto an anonymous leak, would leave the public record exactly as wrong as the original article had left it. He was not doing this, he told the room, to generate good press. He was doing it because his son currently ate real food 3 nights a week, and he intended for the world to know precisely why. When Do-yoon told her about the press dinner, Amarachi listened fully before responding, then set one condition of her own, delivered with the same flat clarity he had used with the operations director. She did not want the dinner framed as a gesture of gratitude, a kind chef rewarding a devoted employee for good behavior. She had seen enough of that narrative already, in the article's condescension and in the comment section's cruelty, and she would not trade one flattening story for a marginally kinder one. What she wanted, she told him, was a formal promotion to line supervisor with a corresponding sponsorship renewal, filed on the basis of documented culinary merit, not personal favor, processed exactly as any other qualified promotion would be. With the same paperwork and the same scrutiny any Korean national cook would receive for the role. She wanted her recipe, if it appeared on the menu permanently rather than for one press event, attributed with her name and her technique explained accurately, not softened into vaguely inspired by. Do-yoon agreed to every term without negotiating a single one down, and Amarachi understood, watching him take notes rather than simply promise verbally, that he intended to make good on it through the same rigorous process he applied to everything else in his kitchen, which was, she realized, exactly the kind of respect she had been asking for all along. Ha-jun was not supposed to be in the dining room the night of the press dinner, according to the original plan, but he asked to come, specifically, and Do-yoon, after a brief conversation with Yoon-hee, agreed to let him sit at a small table near the pass, where he could watch without being photographed directly. He watched his father and Amarachi work side by side at a station set up in full view of the seated journalists, an arrangement neither man in his father's kitchen had ever seen before, the towering, unreachable chef and the line cook from the hallway standing at matching stations, plating a dish neither of them dressed up beyond what the recipe actually needed. Ha-jun recognized the smell before he recognized the technique, the specific warm, nutty scent of toasted melon seed that had, over 3 months, become one of the few smells in the world that did not make his stomach clench with dread. He watched Amarachi explain the dish to a reporter holding a small recorder, watched her name typed visibly onto a printed menu card a server carried past his table, and felt something he did not yet have words for, a small, fierce pride in a woman who had, technically, broken a rule to feed him and was now being applauded, in front of strangers with cameras, for exactly that. Han Su-min had accepted the invitation to the press dinner, expecting a carefully managed apology tour, the kind of event designed to smooth over a story rather than actually address it, and had arrived with her skepticism fully intact. What she watched instead, over the course of 2 hours, did not fit the narrative she had helped construct 4 weeks earlier. She watched Kang Do-yoon, a chef she had profiled twice before and had never once seen explain a dish's origin with visible emotion, describe in detail how a Nigerian line cook had adapted a family recipe for a grieving 8-year-old, crediting her technique specifically rather than glossing it into a vague inspirational anecdote. She watched Amarachi answer questions about her training and her culinary background with a composure that made Su-min's earlier framing of her as merely sponsored foreign staff look, in retrospect, both lazy and unjust. She watched Ha-jun eat an entire plate at a small table nearby, an 8-year-old whose eating difficulties her own article had reduced to a single sympathetic detail rather than the center of the actual story. Su-min left that night and wrote a follow-up piece under a different framing entirely, one that corrected the record explicitly rather than quietly, because she recognized, professionally and personally, that she had gotten the story wrong the first time, and that getting it right the second time mattered more than protecting her original scoop. Amarachi's promotion to line supervisor was processed through the operations office 6 weeks later, exactly as she had requested, with the same documentation review applied to any other qualified candidate, a fact she confirmed herself by asking, directly, whether any step had been skipped or expedited on her behalf. None had. Her sponsorship renewal came through shortly after, tied now to a supervisory role rather than an entry-level line position, a change that extended her legal standing in the country by 3 additional years and gave her, for the first time since arriving in Seoul, a visa status she had earned on paper, rather than one she quietly feared losing every time an unexpected email appeared in her inbox. Her jollof rice, adjusted slightly for a broader palate but still carrying its gentler, stock-loosened character, appeared on Yun's staff meal rotation permanently and, eventually, as a seasonal addition to the tasting menu itself, listed under her full name exactly as she had asked. Chef Lim, to Amarachi's genuine surprise, was the one who suggested the seasonal addition to Do-yoon, telling him privately that whatever his initial concerns about procedure had been, he had never once had a problem with her cooking, only with not knowing what was happening in his own kitchen. A distinction he now understood had been about trust rather than talent all along. The months that followed did not produce anything either Do-yoon or Amarachi would have described, even privately, as a sudden romance, and both were, in their separate ways, relieved by that. What developed instead was slower and more deliberate, built the way both of them built everything that mattered to them, one careful decision at a time. Do-yoon began asking Amarachi's opinion on menu changes beyond her own dishes, not as a courtesy but because her palate had, over the better part of a year, proven itself sharper than most of the kitchen's more senior voices. They ate together occasionally after service, sometimes with Ha-jun, sometimes without, conversations that moved gradually from technique and ingredients toward the kind of ordinary personal territory neither of them had made time for in years: her mother's health back home, his own father's disapproval of the restaurant he had built, small, unremarkable facts, exchange the way people exchange them when they have decided, without formally deciding, that they intend to keep knowing each other. Neither rushed it. Do-yoon had learned, from 8 months of watching his son heal in small increments rather than sudden ones, that the things worth keeping were rarely the things that arrived quickly. And Amarachi, who had spent 2 years protecting herself from exactly this kind of vulnerability, found she no longer wanted to. On a Sunday nearly a year after the night Yoon-hee had knocked twice on a service door, Ha-jun stood on a stool in his own family's kitchen for the first time since his mother had died. A kitchen that had sat unused for so long the spice jars still held her handwriting on their labels. Amarachi had brought her own melon seeds and her own dried peppers, insisting gently that Do-yoon's kitchen, however professionally equipped, still needed a few things that belonged specifically to her, and Do-yoon, standing at the counter chopping onions under her direction rather than his own, found himself in the unfamiliar position of being the least skilled cook in the room and not minding at all. Ha-jun narrated the pepper additions the way he always had: one sliver, weight, taste, another sliver, a ritual that had, somewhere in the past year, become simply how their family cooked together rather than a strategy anyone had designed. Sunlight came through the kitchen window at an angle Do-yoon had not noticed in months, catching the steam off the pot in a way that made the small room feel, for the first time since winter, entirely alive. Amarachi caught Do-yoon watching his son stir with total unself-conscious focus, and something passed between the two adults that neither needed to name out loud, a recognition that the emptiness in this particular kitchen had, quietly, been filled. When the rice was finally done, Amarachi filled 3 bowls at the same counter where, 11 months earlier in a different kitchen entirely, she had once set down a single small portion in front of a boy who would not lift his spoon. This bowl was plain white, the same simple ware Ha-jun's specialists had once tried and failed to make appealing with colored charts and reward stickers. No garnish, no careful plating, exactly the kind of bowl his mother might have used on an ordinary Sunday. Ha-jun ate all of it, steadily, without hesitation, narrating each bite the way he narrated everything now, and when he finished, he pushed the empty bowl toward the center of the table and said, plainly, that he wanted more. Do-yoon refilled it himself, ladling the rice with the careful attention of a man who had once believed his own hands were useless in this particular kitchen. And Amarachi watched the two of them, father and son, sitting close together at a table that finally, after a year of hallways and folding tables, and a scandal survived on merit rather than mercy, belonged to all 3 of them equally. The white bowl that opened this story had been empty for 8 months. This one, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, was already being filled again, and Ha-jun, spoon in hand, was asking, without any hesitation at all, for seconds.